Thank you so much for being here today. We are very happy to present our Faculty Research Grant recipients from 2022, presenting on the projects that they completed as part of their research grant. And in this segment, I'm very happy to have Dr. Jaclyn Fowler, and her title is Getting to the Heart of Duality, Celtic Folklore in the Literature and Poetry of Celtic and Celtic American Writers. So Jackie, I'm going to hand the floor over to you, and we're happy to take questions throughout if you want to type them into the chat or come off of mute and speak. This is intended to be interactive, so just jump in as you'd like.
Yeah, honestly, for you guys, it doesn't upset me if you break in and ask a question. I'm going to start by giving you a little bit of background on the research that I've been doing. And after you heard Jenny give that long title, I shortened it to a shorter title, or a shorter long title. And so basically, if I distill it down, it's called In the Deep Heart's Core, Latent Irish-ness at the Heart of Yeats's Seminal Work. And for anyone who is an English teacher or a lover of poetry or a lover of Irish history or Irish literature, William Butler Yeats is probably known to you. I have been doing research on Yeats my whole life, and so this really is nerd heaven for me. So I want to share some of the ideas. Yeats became a fairly famous poet in his very young. He was in his early 20s when he started publishing some of his best work. And he was among a group of people who were pushing back against 700 years of brutal subjugation by England. And it was a time when they were not allowed to speak their language under penalty of death. They weren't allowed to talk about their myths or their historical figures. They weren't allowed to do their art or sing or dance. Now, most of the Irish did. They continued to do that, but they whispered it. They kept it in the back hallways of their homes and with their neighbors, and they were very careful not to allow their Irish-ness to be out in front. And Yeats, along with other writers, had decided that it was time to reestablish Irish-ness as okay in the world. And I know that sounds really silly, but it wasn't at that point. It was outlawed. They didn't own their own land anymore. The English had taken the land and redistributed it to Anglo-Normans and Anglos. Yeats, of course, his family was one of those who received a distribution of land. But by the time Yeats started writing, it was 700 years his family had been in Ireland, so he felt himself Irish. And so what happened is they created what is called either the Gaelic Revival or the Celtic Twilight. And it was this incredible group, late 19th century, early 20th century artists that focused on revitalizing a sense of Irishness, to make it okay again, to bring it out into the forefront, so you didn't have to hide it anymore. And many of them started to speak Irish as a regular. Yeats tried and tried and tried to learn Irish, and he just couldn't, but he did the best he could, and I'll show you what he did. And one of the greatest parts about his poetry is that he references the myths and the ancient historical figures of Ireland, which are embedded in the landscape. So the Irish always had a connection to the land because their myths and their landscape come from this. And that's what I was doing in my research grant. So I looked at myth based on how Yeats wrote his poetry. And so one of the first things Yeats did is he incorporated Druid incantation. And later on, I use this as a part of a research presentation I made in County Sligo, in the International Yeats House during the Literature Festival of Ireland, which was a great thing that came of this grant. But he used the Druidic incantation, and he used it in a way that imitated the structure and internal chaos of the Irish language. But because he couldn't learn Irish, he just couldn't learn it, he moved what was Irish into the English language and used it. And that's why sometimes Yeats is a little hard to understand, because he's using the Irish structure. So let me give you an example of what's possible in Irish. you can talk about the here and the not here at the same time, and there's no logical inconsistency. So for instance, when I was down in County Cork a few months ago, someone said to me, would you look at that there? Would you look at my bike? It's not there anymore. Oh, okay. So I had to look at it, but it wasn't there. And that for them made perfect sense. And so that's the Irish coming through. And you can see that in Yeats's poetry. He also did this thing where he built into the landscape the idea of the fairies. Now, when we talk about fairies here, we think about them as mythical creatures, and we think about them with wings and flying around. Not the same in Ireland. They're the old pantheon, the old gods of the Celtic pantheon. And what they believe is that they've gone underground. So they're in the other world, and they're just waiting to come back and reclaim Ireland. And so the fairies are gods and goddesses in Ireland. And their places are physical. I'll show you that in a second. And so they build a connection to Irish myth and Irish heroic history. And sometimes it's pseudo history, but let me show you. So those of you who like Outlander, and I know there's a few of you in here, but you may recognize these kinds of stone circles. These are passageways into tombs. This is a massive one out where Yeats grew up, a massive tomb. And they exist all over Scotland and Ireland. So part of what I did in my grant last year was to also visit the Highlands to see how the poets of Scotland congregated around the fairy structures. These are called the fairy structures in Ireland and Scotland. And in Irish, the name of fairies is the she. And so if you've ever heard somebody say banshee, that's what they mean. Ban means a woman fairy, and she's not very nice, right? She comes to announce death. And you'll see these all over the Celtic regions, because here's the thing. They believe it's the gateway to the other world, to the other Celtic pantheon, so that the structure, the myth is physical. You can literally go to see the myth in these countries. And so what Yeats does, he writes about it. And I always laugh because the farmers over there, you'll see the farm being farmed, but you'll see the stone circle standing, or there's a school where there's a stone circle in the middle of the schoolyard, because even if you don't believe in fairies, you're not going to test it out. Like, you're just going to leave their structures there because just in case there are. So all over Ireland, you see this. The other thing that happens is that in the myth cycles, they mention things, and especially in Yeats's poetry, you'll see it. He talks about this mythical mountain called Ben Bulben. It's very familiar in Yeats's poetry, but it's important. The people know it because it's where some of their mythic heroes came from, like Cuchulainn or Finn McCool. And if anyone ever heard of Finn McCool, or if you've heard of in the early part of the 20th century when the British would call them the Fenians, Finn McCool, Fenian comes from Finn McCool. Finn McCool was the army general of the old Irish army. And so everybody who would look at Ben Bulben would know those mythical stories. Yeats also talks about Queen Maeve, and he talks about how Cuchulainn, the great warrior, would go down into the cave of cats, and he would spend nights, like, to prove your worth, your mettle as a person, you had to go into the cave and you have to stay there in the darkness. And so, it's not a national monument or anything. It's on a guy's farm who, lets you go down if you want to. And just in case you thought that I didn't really utilize the grant well, here's a picture of deep inside. There are no handrails, there are no lights. The only light that you take down with you is a flashlight, and you literally slide down into the structure. It's very thin, it's very scary. And then when you turn out your flashlight, you're alone, and it is devastatingly scary. And so you get to experience what the great heroes of ancient Ireland experienced. But it's also the reason that Irish-ness remained, is that it was part of the landscape. Yeats's poetry has an effect on society. So he built pride in being Irish or of Ireland. Because remember, Yeats is Anglo-Norman, but he'd been there for, his family had been there for 700 years. So he considered himself of Ireland. And his words, his poetry about the myths of Ireland actually impacted the fight for freedom. And if anyone knows about the GPO, the General Post Office in Dublin, that the volunteers of the Irish Republic took over and got pounded, but it was the first step in the Irish freedom fight. And they did it because of Yeats's poetry, in part because of Yeats's poetry. One of the survivors of the GPO was Michael Collins. He was really famous. He is the man that they credit with bringing England to its knees. He's from down in the South. He actually signed the peace treaty that gave Ireland its freedom. And when I was down doing research, I actually met his family. And as we began to talk, I realized that there was a book in that too. And so they invited me to come and read all of his letters and his journals. And now I get to tell you what happened as a result of this really incredible grant that I had. So as a result of the grant, the first thing that happened is I was invited to speak for Ireland's National Literary Day. Like, that's crazy. How could that have happened? This American girl, I was the featured speaker at the International Yeats house. And you can see, if anyone knows Yeats, you'll recognize the cover of his book stenciled on the wall here. And I got the chance to stand in front of the fireplace where his granddaughter had just played the harp and then talk about how he used Druidic incantation in his poetry. I'm telling you, it was like nerd mecca for me. And then the second thing that happened is I won a short story contest and I was invited to read at the West Cork Literary Festival. And this is the place where people you might know, like Frank McCourt, and there's so many Irish literary people who read here that it was just incredible to be able to read among them. And so that came as the grant. I have already said I met the Collins family in West Cork, and this is inside the pub where his family still owns, and he spent his last day. I got to present at the College English Association in April, and I used the title of this because it was too long to use the title I put on the grant. And I have a research article, a 9,000 word research article that's on the second round at the International Yeats Journal. So I'm expecting to hear any day whether they take it or not. And that's a huge thing for Yeats scholars. And because I met the Collins family, I have written a novel. I'm 2 chapters from finishing the novel. I go back to County Cork this summer, and I'll be reading the novel inside pubs across the south of Ireland, just to get a read from the Irish people on how I'm doing. Now, the Collins family has been reading it along. As I finish chapters, I send them. And so have a group of other people in Ireland, including senators and not, they don't call them representatives, but like our representatives in the Congress. So that all came because of this grant. And that's just a quick update, and I'm really happy to take questions.
Thank you, Jackie.
And then if you want me to talk about Yeats more, Lord, I will. So you better ask some questions.
Yes, folks, please either come off of mute and ask some questions about this really fascinating research, or type in the chat.
You know, the really cool thing about the grant is it's the gift that keeps on giving. So, you know, I wrote an article about Yeats. I presented on Yeats. I wrote a novel about Michael Collins. I'm now doing research on poets in Scotland that connect with Yeats. And it just keeps generating new information. Krista, it looks like you came off mute. I'm wondering if you have a question.
I did, but then all these questions came up in the chat. So I'll just ask it really quickly, I guess. This is so fascinating. What an amazing opportunity. I'm dying that my college kid is not here because she's so into history. And Ireland, actually. I'm going to share the recording with her and probably the book too. So this is amazing. But so I guess my question, as I came on, you were kind of alluding to it. I was just wondering if you had looked at, the cross culture with other, other mythologies and traditions from that same area, because I know there's, several that intertwine in that region.
Yeah, that's a great question. So again, like here's the gift that keeps on giving, right? You bump into something doing research and then you explore, you go down the rabbit hole a little bit. So I wrote a paper and it's a small paper that was published this year on, it's called the Sheila gigs. I don't know if you know what that is. If your child likes Irish history and myths, she might know, but there are like ancient, if you know the sculpture of Kali in Indian culture, it looks like that. And it's on all ancient buildings that have been, since then turned into Catholic churches or then again converted to Church of England. And so there's a real connection between Celtic myth, and that's Wales and Scotland and the smaller places, and India. Like there's a direct connection between the myths of the Celtic regions and the myths of India. So I've been playing with that a little bit in research. So yeah, I think that's going to be another research line.
That's really great. Thank you.
And Summer asked, how do you integrate the research into your classes? A couple of ways, some not traditional, like the excitement that I feel with creating a fairly new line of research on Yeats. Yeats was a magician, and he, in the Yeats house, he hand drew tarot cards, and he was into automatic writing, but they kept that quiet for the longest time, for decades, because they thought it would affect how seriously he was taken as a poet. And so the research I'm doing on Druid incantation and the things that he brought, it's all over his poetry. Magic is all over his poetry. And so it's really kind of fun now to be able to all of a sudden put that into the official Yeats stuff. So to be invited to the International Yeats House and then to be on the second round for the International Yeats Journal when I'm talking about magic in Yeats's poetry. And so it's kind of fun. So it's that kind of thing, that vibrancy I can bring into classes, but it's also, I teach mostly composition, but I often use Yeats's poetry to help me teach writing.
You have a question in the chat from Rachel.
Michael. Yeah, there was a movie by Liam Neeson. It was kind of historically accurate. It's a great movie if you haven't seen it. And when I was down in the town where it was filmed, Liam Neeson is there all the time. He has a house there now. He fell in love with the story. But Michael Collins was, for those of you who know the IRA, that's like a break off of the group that Michael Collins created to help win Ireland's freedom. So when you hear about the spies being shot, what Collins set up was any Irishman or woman who was giving information to the British that would hurt the Irish nation. He sent them a note saying, stop, or you'll be killed. And then they followed through on it. And what happened was it brought Britain to its knees because they had no more informers in the country. And so they couldn't respond and react in enough time to make it work. Michael Collins was killed just after he signed the treaty because the IRA broke apart and they turned against him. So he had those loyal to him. They became the police force that now still takes care of Ireland. And then the IRA, who split apart from that group, and ended up killing him in his own backyard, basically. Pretty cool dude. Young, he was in 30s. He would have created a more secular government at the beginning than what had happened afterwards. Catholicism was not allowed to be practiced, so there was a complete swing the other way when the Irish Free State came in.
I'm pretty curious about what Druidic incantation is or what you learned about it through that process of researching.
I'm sorry, Jenny, the first part got cut off.
I'm curious about Druidic incantation and what that actually is.
Yeah.
And what you learned.
So you guys might not know this, but Irish Gaelic is one of the oldest known written languages. And it was the first language that had a really strong literary tradition. Now, when the Romans came in, they burned most of the transcripts and most of the scrolls, so there's not a lot left of it. But the first Irish speaker who landed on the island was a Druid named Amergin. And Amergin, as he came on, he did a poem. It was the first poem in Irish, but it was really an incantation. I am the wind, I am the sea, I am the ocean. And so in other words, what he was doing is he was gathering the natural elements to him. And so if you read a lot of Yeats's poetry, you can hear the same incantation. And he does it in exactly the same beats of the sounds in Irish. So he very often uses Amergin. Another person who used Druidic incantation, this might surprise you, is St. Patrick. So there's a thing called the Lorca of Patrick, and he does the same thing. But the crux of Amergin's is, I will arise and go now. So anyone who knows Yeats, when he says, I will arise and go now and go to Innisfree, it's coming directly from the Druids, which is, I always thought, cool. So
thank you. Does anyone else have questions or comments?
Oh, come on, ask me something obscure and I'll tell you some fun stuff. This summer, I go down for July. I'm down in Cork in the southern, it's called the Rebel County. That's where Michael Collins is from. And I've been asked to read in pubs. Now, just so in case people don't know, pubs are like the all family thing. It's not just beer there. It's not just a bar, but it's a place to eat. It's a place to gather. You can go and have tea, but it's also a place where poetry and literature and music are really common. It's, if you have the feel of getting up and reading a poem, everybody in the pub will stop and listen to you. So it's kind of a fun, scary, I'm talking about their man. He's from County Cork, so it's a little scary, but I think it'll be a good thing to hear their response to the Michael Collins book before it goes to publication. Especially since I'm an American.
It's Karen. I have a question. So a couple of years ago, I visited a cousin in Ireland in County Cork, and she was telling, and we have priests in the family, and she was telling me about a time during the war when a family priest was helping, I don't know who, but people were disappeared.
Yep.
Yeah, so I was just wondering, like, how much you still hear about things like that from individual families.
Oh, a lot. So what I did, this is going to sound like a really hard time with the grant, but last year I set up space in O'Donovan's, which was where Michael Collins used to give his speeches in County Cork. And I put out to everybody that there was an American writer who was writing a novel on Michael Collins with the okay of the family. It had to be okayed by the family. And people would come into that pub at all times of the day and sit down and just tell me their stories. And there was a priest, Father Fergus, who had a great uncle in the same church that he was in, who had sheltered Michael Collins. So in the book, there I do the scene that he told me about. Or I went to a trad session. So I don't know if anyone knows what that is. It's when they play traditional music. And anyone who has an instrument and an interest in coming and playing just shows up that night. So I went to the trad session to hear it. And the owner came over to me and said, I hear you're the American writing the book on Michael Collins. Yes. She said, come here, I want to show you something. And she walked me up to the third floor. And it was a room, like a wall of wainscoting. And she pushed on it and it opened up into a hidden room. And it's where Michael Collins would store the guns. And that was happening all the time. In Ireland, it's always present. Like even though Michael Collins died 100 years ago, he's still there, right? So there's never a non-present. So you can talk about Michael Collins as if you just saw him at lunch. And so it happens all the time. It's really fun. Did that answer, Karen?
Oh yeah, we could go on, but I'm starting to look at the clock, so I'm trying to be quiet.
Kent had a
I
question
could not
in the
have done
chat.
this without the research grant. I could not have done this. And I am so grateful that I had the chance to do this and that it just keeps spiraling into other things. And it enriches my teaching, and it enriches, I'm passionate about what I'm doing, about my writing, about everything. And I think, boy, if you guys have an itch that you want to explore and research, what a wonderful opportunity to be able to do it, to just put aside life for a little while and go do it. Do it.
Thank you, Jackie. I mean, this has been amazing. We could spend a long time, and I hope for those who are interested, follow up with Jackie on her short stories, her novels, the publications that are coming out, and I'm sure that you'll be able to delve in deeper and learn a lot more. So